Okay, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started now that everyone's settling in. I see a couple of people that are just arriving. Welcome. Feel free to join us, and please do silence your phones. We're very excited to have you. So just a couple of minutes of opening remarks from me, and then you'll hear from the much more exciting contingent. But I want to welcome all of you here to Columbia Journalism School. It's really a delight to see you. My name is Reed Alexander. For those of you I haven't met, I'm a member of the class of 2020, and the Society of Professional Journalists has worked so hard to put this together. So quick round of applause for all of my colleagues who have worked tirelessly to make tonight possible. We are absolutely delighted to welcome you. So I want to take you back now to a sort of infamous date. On Valentine's Day last year, 2018, in the sleepy community of Parkland, Florida, a lone gunman walked onto the campus of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School carrying an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle. He went on to slaughter 17 innocent victims that afternoon in what became the deadliest mass shooting at a high school in American history. Of course, we all know what happened next. In an unprecedented display of tenacity and courage, the brave students at Parkland united to engage in extraordinary activism, launching a movement that uplifted a nation, empowered a generation, and began the healing process for the shattered hearts of a broken community. The March for Our Lives summoned hundreds of thousands of people to Washington, D.C. to tell the world, in one defiant voice, never again. This stunning show of force was supported by some 800 satellite marches in cities around the world, including London, Paris, Hong Kong, and right here in New York City. It was the brainchild of students who are with us in this very room tonight. Now, I will never forget where I was on the afternoon when I learned that the tragedy had struck. I was a young Dow Jones reporter at the Wall Street Journal building on 6th Avenue here in New York, and hanging over my desk was a large television screen that suddenly flashed with the heart-stopping breaking news. There had been another school shooting. This one happened close to home. You see, I'm originally from Boca Raton. It's a city in South Florida, about half an hour from Parkland. And my first thought, naturally, was, did I know students who were in the school that day? And if I didn't, well, I knew that certainly I would know people who did. But what I could not have known back then was how this particular story, the Parkland story, would change me both as a reporter and as a person. And what's more, the story has also changed the discourse around gun violence in America. Going up against powerful forces of opposition, the young people from Parkland showed that they were undeterred in fighting for the safety of their peers. Over the past year and a half since this shooting, my reporting has opened my eyes to really big-hearted people in that community who are just trying to find their future without being permanently constrained by the anguish of their past. I have seen their resilience and been moved by their strength. So all of us are here tonight at the J School to grow as journalists by hearing from both leading experts and learning from the Parkland students themselves, who have unleashed a wave unlike anything their generation has ever seen. As reporters, we are at the vanguard of public information, so the words that we choose, the pictures that we broadcast, and indeed the ethical decisions that we make in this coverage can shape the public's understanding of major events that define our human journey. So the onus is on all of us to exemplify responsibility, maturity, and morality. For everyone in this room who will graduate in a few months' time and go on to be a reporter, yes, there will come a day and a phone call in our careers when we will be called upon to cover stories like this one. And I hope when that day inevitably does come, that all of us will draw on the lessons that we will learn here together tonight, as seen through the eyes of people telling the stories and seen through the eyes of people who really are the story. So thank you to Columbia Journalism School and to everyone who agrees, as I do, that this conversation matters. In just a moment, I'll invite our terrific panelists to join me here on stage, but for now, it's my privilege to welcome our keynote speaker. This journalist is widely recognized as America's foremost reporter covering school shootings, which is pretty much as tough a beat as there is. He's the author of 2 New York Times best-selling books, Parkland and Columbine. The book Parkland has just been nominated for a Goodreads Choice Award for Best Nonfiction Book of the Year, and according to Anderson Cooper, quote, changed my whole perspective on covering school shootings. We are delighted now to welcome to the stage the celebrated author and investigative journalist, David Cullen. Thank you all very much.
Hi, thanks for that. Can I use this one? Okay, good. Tend to run. Okay, good. Although I forgot my glasses, so I'll have to close. It's really good to be here and see a lot of familiar faces, including some. Oh, it's not working. Okay. Help me, Ron.
All set.
All right, working now? Okay, good. All right, I'm really glad to be here and see a lot of familiar faces and some people from Parkland. I think the first thing about this conference that's really important is that we're going to talk about trauma. We invited, but you all invited Cameron and Alfonso from Parkland so we could hear from some of the people. And I'm really curious as I was thinking about what I was going to say. Please feel free to correct me later, or I'd love your insight on anything I have to say. Because these are things, the way I think about it, but hey, maybe I'm all wet on some of these. Hopefully not all of them. But when I talk about journalism and trauma, I tend to focus on two things, which are kind of the two pillars of the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma, which is here, and I'm an Knockberg Fellow at the DART Center. And the two are sort of self-care for journalists, how we deal with our own trauma, and then of course dealing with survivors more empathetically and thoughtfully. And I want to talk about both of those, but I think there's a third one that we need to add that's really that I think we're going to, I saw on the program, is a third part, which is the perpetrator. And the role they play in this and how we deal with the perpetrators, because there's kind of a reckoning that our profession has come to about that, and I think it's been way too long in coming. So we'll talk about that last. So first, let me talk about the simplest one, which is self-care. Is everybody here a journalist, or for the most part, or planning to be a journalist? Okay, so if you cover trauma, and I sadly now am sort of like the mass murder guy, which is a really horrible thing that I never intended and just got sort of hurled into. But it took me down a couple times. And the first time I had no idea that secondary PTSD is a thing, which it sure as hell is. Until I saw Dr. Frank Gottberg, who created the DART Center, I saw a presentation he did in Boulder about 6 months after Columbine, and he was talking about how EMTs and emergency room people and all sorts of different professions deal with this and are aware of it, and journalists are the one profession, trauma journalists, who are completely oblivious to it and do nothing and just fall apart. And don't even admit it. And he had sort of like a list of different symptoms, and I was like, shit, like I've got every one of those. And it was completely eye-opening for me. And then I became a member, I got therapy, I did all the important things which you need to do to sort of recover, and I don't want to talk about those. I want to talk about the flip side of that, which is sort of diminishing the pain and the darkness. Those are very important, and you can go to the dark side, all sorts of sites, see lots of advice about that, and you should do all those things. I want to talk about the flip side of that, which took me, I guess, about 7 or 8 years to figure out. And it was when I was writing Columbine, I was in about year 7 or 8, and it wasn't going that well. I was, I think, on my second publisher of the 3 that it finally took, and years behind on my contract, and really struggling with it because it was dark, among other things, and it was a really difficult story to get my arms around. And I remember talking to my agent, Betsy Lerner, who's sort of like a writer whisperer, who's a great person at sort of diagnosing writer problems and helping us figure out a way out of them. And I said, God, maybe I just, I'm supposed to go to the gym tonight. Maybe I need to quit that. I need to maybe cut back that altogether. And I was already working on 6-day weeks. And I'm like, do I just need to do 7? And she was like, no. You've got it all wrong. You love the gym. You can't cut that out. You need to do more of that. You need to make it a priority. You need to structure your day around the fact that you will be able to go there every day. Because I was down to just like a couple days a week when I used to go like 5 or 6. She said, you need to do that every day. And you need to think about what are the things in your life that give you pleasure and joy and build you up, and make some of those a priority. So I did it with the gym, and I took her advice, and I was like, wow, I can do this. And I thought about the other ones, and the other great love of my life at that time was like going dancing. I'm a big gay guy, and I love going to gay clubs on Saturday night and getting blackout drunk, and just wildly dancing and staying up to 4 or 5 in the morning and just having a great time. And I cut back on that too, but I just really, really love doing it. So I gave myself permission that Sundays were completely off. I could be as hungover as I wanted, guilt-free, did not have to do anything on Sunday, because Saturday night I could just like dance and drink, for me it's vodka and Red Bull, as much as I wanted. And by the way, I'm not saying to do self-destructive things, and in this case it kind of worked out that one thing I did was like very good for my body, and the other one wasn't great for my body. So it is all about balance, but these are the things that gave me great, incredible joy. And only really after the fact, I realized that there was so much darkness that was taking inside of me. And by the way, I actually think about the metaphor that I use as sort of like plutonium. For me, especially that first week with the Columbine kids, where I was out there in Clement Park every day with them, and I had no idea that they were like radiating their grief. And it was like they were radioactive and toxic, and I was taking that, absorbing that into my body, and I had no idea, and that's with me for life. I'm not getting over that. But you can get as much as possible out of that, but the other half of the equation is you're never going to get it all out. And realizing what are the joyful things that can bring light into my life and my body to help balance that and make me a whole person. And for me, that was the really crucial part of the equation that took me about 8 years to figure out, and that really has helped get me through, is figure out how to bring joy into my life, to balance it. Because I'm not getting rid of all the pain. That's just part of the job. So, that's all I'm going to say about the first one. I got to do these really briefly. The second one is survivors and being more empathetic. And I guess asked about that all the time, and sort of I think about it, like my first rule is like pretty simple, and I have a whole list of things, but most of them revolve around one, which is don't be a dick. Which is sometimes harder than it sounds. And you've got to think about what that means too. And I'll give you one quick example is, that may not sound like being a dick, but when I first got down to Parkland, it was, I believe, 6 days after Cameron gave me directions how to get to a meeting that Jackie Korn was going to have. Because a month before they had the March on Washington, they had the sort of first strike on Tallahassee. They were taking 3 buses, 100 kids up there, and they had an organizational meeting the day before. And I really wanted to be there the day before to just see sort of the behind-the-scenes stuff. And I talked to Jackie on the phone Sunday, I guess that was in your living room, and she sort of like briefed me, and she knew I was going to be there. And so when I was there, of course, it was hectic, all sorts of good stuff going on, and I just, I said, introduced myself. She said, oh, hi. I'm like, do you have some time for an interview? And she said, no, I really don't. It's just insane, and I don't. And I was like, okay. So for the next 48 hours, I spent just sort of shadowing her, and I was often, this far away from her. And she knew that whole time I really, really wanted to interview her. And she was a key person on this part of the story, and I really needed that interview. Never once did I ask again. Partly because I knew if she did have time or relented or, time or the emotional wattage to do it, she would offer. And I wasn't going to be a pest and keep asking, God, did I want to? But I held my tongue and I never did. And the dirty secret, I don't think it's much of a secret. I think most of you here probably realize if you whine enough and push enough, you can usually get the interview. You can usually wear them down. They'll give you the interview. They'll give you that interview. That might be the last interview they ever give you. Or they're not opening any doors to you in the future. Instead, after that, I never did bug her, but I interviewed her dad and her mom briefly, and I got phone numbers from both of them, so I texted just a few days later saying I'd love to do a follow-up interview with Jackie, and her mom said, God, unfortunately, there's this media company now, I can't even remember, it was More Precision, that everything has to go through them. And I was like, shit. And her dad texted about 5 minutes later and said, she's going to call you in about half an hour. He said, you know, we're in DC right now. We're meeting with, I think they were meeting with Nancy Pelosi and all sorts of people. But in the car on the way back, she's going to call you. And she was very happy to talk to me. And part of it was because I played the long game. And not as a game, not to get the later interview, but I just decided not to be a dick the first 2 days and to give her the space and be sort of like a decent human being about it. And I didn't do it for the later interviews, but it paid off. And later, she was the one, when I talked to her, who got permission from the rest of the group to go into the headquarters and to do a lot of other things. And she became one of the heroes of the book because she's played an amazing role. So that's one thing. Now, there's obviously a little bit more to it than that. There's a lot of things you can do to be a more empathetic interviewer, writer. So much what have I learned. The best person I learned ever from is, I had his name on my phone because I can never remember his name. It was several years ago at an Neiman concert in Harvard, where a lot of the dark people were there, and there was an amazing man. Where is his name? I didn't want to get it right. I took a bunch of pictures on the way in. Now if I can say it. Asad was Skylo, we'll say. Okay, Asad was from Bosnia-Herzegovina, and at this time, at least several years ago, when I met him, he ran the Rape Counseling Center in Phoenix, the largest one. And he's a psychiatrist, specializing in trauma, obviously. Brilliant guy. Dr. Akbar interviewed him on stage and asked, what's the most important thing journalists like us need to know about interviewing anyone who's been raped, been through any of these horrible things? And Asa said, safe. You have to make them feel safe. You can't go anywhere until they feel safe with you. And that's stuck with me ever since. And while I was waiting for his answer, the word in my mind was trust. They have to trust you. Which I think those are two very similar concepts, but I like his better, feeling safe. But that's sort of a baseline. That's the very first thing. But we can do a lot better than going beyond safe. And the biggest thing I learned from him was sort of like inadvertent on his part, because Asa has the best concentration camp jokes I have ever heard in my life. And he has a million of them, and they're very funny and witty. And by the end of this 3-day conference, I had a bunch of good concentration camp jokes too, because I was making a zillion of them with him, which may sound really horrible and an awful thing to say, right? The reason he is standing to make those is because the part I left out of the story is he survived several concentration camps in Serbia. He was one of the intelligent people of the town that the Serbs rounded up in the war with Bosnia-Herzegovina and threw him in a concentration camp and moved him around to several of them. And he spent, I believe it was 10 months in there. They did horrible things to him. So he is standing to make any jokes he wants to, and that's the other reason he was at the conference. Not only does he spend his life constantly other people, he's been a horrible victim of just relentless trauma. But the reason I was making jokes is because the first day I met him, he made a joke about it. I think everybody was like, okay. The second time, I noticed kind of a mischievous look, and almost, I'm not sure how to put my finger, it was sort of like, almost like begging us to make one back. Now I can't describe how I knew this, but I really had the sense he wanted to. By the third time, I was pretty sure that's what he was wanting, is to egging us on. And so I made a crack back. And, it was a conference of journalists, and, everybody else kind of gasped, and he just cracked up. And then it was very, very clear, okay, that's what he wanted. We bonded and spent the rest of the 3 days hanging out together and making a zillion jokes. The point of that story is you have to get on the wavelength of your source. And whatever it is, it's never going to be that again. That's probably the only time in my life that's going to be true of making concentration camp jokes. And it will probably never be something that comes up with you. But the reason I use that is the most extreme example I can give you, and it's true, it was real. And actually, by the way, I was really surprised no one else at that conference ever started doing it. Like, we were just making them left and right, and everybody else kind of cringed. But I was like, it's okay to make them with him. Like he's the only survivor here. Like, if I was a group of Jewish people who survived Auschwitz, I wouldn't be making them with them, right? But he's giving me the time. I'm going to wrap it up. But however audacious it has to be, is understand who you're talking to. And everyone is different and drastically different. So if making the person feel safe and on their wavelength is being very quiet and respectful and soft pedaling and lowering your voice and all those sorts of kind of obvious things, great. Take your cues from that person. If that's how they're acting, mirror that back. But some people hate that. Some people are never going to get comfortable. Like these two here we're going to see as like our two cut-ups who are very, very funny. Now, I don't believe I ever made jokes about that with you because you were a lot closer to it. He was years away. But I didn't make lots of jokes with you because they want you to make jokes back. Whatever your person is, you need to read that person, mirror that behavior, but really wavelength is the word I want you to remember. It's like wherever they're at, meet them there. That's where they feel the most comfortable. That's where they're going to open up to you. So if you make them feel safe, you may have a good interview, but they're not going to open up the same way as if you get on the same wavelength with them. Okay, and the third thing, hopefully that will come up with a panel. Hopefully we'll talk about perpetrators and how we really need to drastically change what we're doing with them, and I think we're on the road to that. But hopefully that's a good start. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dave. And Dave is right, we are going to be talking about a lot of those themes tonight, so thank you so much for those remarks. All right, so now it's time to get into our panel discussion, and I'm really thrilled to introduce you to the 5 people who will be joining me. So I want to start with our very first speaker here in the front row to help us make sense of the effects of trauma on the people who sustain it. Dr. Gail Saltz, she's a renowned psychiatrist, mental health expert, best-selling author, and she's a familiar face to millions of Americans as a contributor to leading news networks discussing these topics on television almost every day. Dr. Saltz, please come up. All right, second, 2 students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. They are the original architects of the March for Our Lives movement, named to the list of the Time 100 Most Influential People last year. Please welcome Parkland students, college undergrads, 2 of my friends, Cameron Caskey and Alfonso Calderon. Next up, another student from South Florida, this one a student journalist who recalls the pain that he felt on the day of the shooting in Parkland when he discovered that one of his close friends had in fact been a victim of the massacre. The experience inspired him to do a deep journalistic dive and investigative report into misappropriation in the Broward County School District, which had taken place in the run-up to the shooting. Please welcome a terrific young reporter, Kenneth Preston. And now a member of our Columbia journalism community, a terrific faculty member of ours, veteran conflict reporter who has covered war and violence and trauma around the world. Please welcome journalist and author, our very own Professor Judith Matloff. All right, everyone. I want all of you to think of questions throughout the process of this because we'll do a moderated discussion for the first 45 minutes or so, and then we want to hear your questions. So there's a microphone in the center, and we'll send one of our members around to facilitate questions in other parts of the room. It's going to be great. I want to begin with sort of the question on everyone's mind, which is roughly 18 months after a massacre like we saw in Parkland, how does a community start to put the pieces together when the cameras have finally gone away? So Cameron, Alfonso, I wonder if you'll take our first question to give us a quick sort of mental health update on how young people and the community at large are doing right now.
Well, you know, it's interesting because Alfonso and I have a lot of friends right now who are still going to school. And that's something I'm not really able to wrap my head around because there are kids who were freshmen when this was happening. As a matter of fact, most of the students in the building that got massacred were freshmen, and they're coming back to school every single day. I can tell you, I went to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School before anybody got killed, and I would still feel bad for them now, and yet they go back every day. They go to the site of a massacre every single day, and they're just expected to have to do AP US history and expected to have to care about school when there's this sometimes spoken, sometimes unspoken understanding that everybody is sitting in those classrooms yards away from where 17 people were shot and 17 people were shot and injured, and then 17 people were killed. And since then, we've also unfortunately lost 2 people to suicide.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that. Alfonso, I wonder if you want to share with us a little of what happened in those suicides earlier this year.
Definitely. Just before anything, I really wanted to point out that when you asked that question, you said, how does the community put the pieces back together? The truth is, some of the pieces are missing, and they're not going to come back. And that's the reality that I think most people, especially in the case of the tragedy that happened after as well, people don't know how to react to something that is not normal. This is not supposed to be normal. And, I was on a phone call today with one of my buddies who obviously still goes to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. They're in the theater program. And even though theater, at least for me, was such a great escape of getting out of class and not worrying about homework and not worrying about anything, the truth is every show is still dedicated and prefaced with, this goes out to the 17 people who were lost on this campus. The truth is there's still a giant monument in the middle of the school courtyard reminding kids every single day of this tragedy. And believe it or not, the building where most of the massacre happened is still in the school. It's hard to move on as a community when every single piece that you need to move on is simply not there.
And the really messed up thing about that, I'd say, is one of the things that got really lost, and this is something that a lot of my friends who got into activism after this, we've all kind of realized has just been such a dark symptom of all of this, is everybody was so excited about the youth activists. Everybody's standing up and youthing so hard on everyone. We're youthing every day. We're the youth. We're going to change everything. A bunch of children. We're going to totally change the entire world just because. But one of the things that got lost in all of the chaos after the shooting was the fact that there is trauma there that we haven't even been able to really figure out or understand. And there are students who, unlike Alfonso and I, were not on television talking to people about mass shootings. There were students who were just there, and they just watched the whole world get excited about us and look at the students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas as these heroes and these thought leaders and these geniuses that could talk about anything. And yet we're all kids who were at school when a lot of people got killed. So nobody really took the time, and the people who did unfortunately weren't heard or listened to, but nobody took the time to say, there are thousands of kids at that school that day, and thousands of people are forever traumatized.
Judith Matloff, I want to bring you in on that point. You've obviously covered really traumatic situations around the world. Explain to us what goes through a reporter's mind, some of the challenges that we face as journalists when we get into a traumatic situation and we have the pressures of a deadline and editors, but what should we also be thinking about the mindset, and then Dr. Saltz, I want to bring you in on that as well, of the people whom we're interviewing?
Well, I think David said it very eloquently. You don't want to do any harm. You have to be very respectful to the people who you're interviewing, and you want to take it as slow as possible. I think to a certain extent, my career has been abroad, and covering wars is a much slower process. It's not one day of shooting and then the press descended. It's something that you're covering over a long period of time. Oftentimes, most of your subjects want you to tell their stories. They're actually begging you to. When I was in Rwanda after the genocide, there were people who wanted their stories told. These are oftentimes countries where the rule of law doesn't operate, where the crimes are not going to be tried in any court. So people actually are begging you to tell their stories, and it makes your job a little bit easier because you feel you're fulfilling a mission that your subjects want you to fulfill.
Dr. Gail Saltz, a traumatic event happens, Parkland happens, 9/11, I know something you and I have talked about has happened. Explain to me what kinds of personality types respond in different ways to trauma. Some people are motivated to speak out. Some people really have trouble processing what they've been through and are almost sort of paralyzed. what are the natural responses we see? I know it's a sort of broad question, but what can we predict in the wake of a traumatic event?
So it is normal to feel traumatized after you've been either part of a trauma or very close by or privy. What do we really mean by that? We mean somebody who has had an experience where their life felt threatened, or somebody that they loved, their life was threatened, or they've suffered some violence in that sort of way. And we know that immediately afterwards, it is actually really normal to be very fearful, to have symptoms of maybe difficulty sleeping, difficulty being present in your everyday life, not feeling upset, crying, disturbed a lot of the time. And then the question becomes, who is going to, in the coming weeks, sort of slowly come back from that, essentially, and who will go on to develop an acute stress reaction or a post-traumatic stress reaction, which basically is day-to-day sort of trying to avoid the trauma by either numbing themselves out, dissociating, trying to not be present, trying not to think about it, trying not to go back to the school or anything that would remind them of that, or it causes the other reaction, which is a constant sort of high arousal of the body, so feeling panicky, feeling like your chest is beating, you're breathing fast, you're sweating.
Physical response.
And the problem, I guess I would say, is we don't always know. You can't tell as a journalist by looking at this person which one of you is going to be the person that's going to unfortunately go down that path. We know that women are more likely to than men. We know that people who've had trauma in their past before this traumatic experience are more likely to. We know that people who don't have support systems outside to help them as they're moving through are more likely to. We know that people who have suffered the kind of trauma you two suffered are more likely to than, for example, a more diffuse, like a natural disaster. I mean, that's a trauma. If you lose your home, there can be traumas that are large traumas, but the very specific, somebody came in with a gun and you thought you were going to die, or somebody next to you did die, that kind of trauma for women, a rape, a personal victimization, that kind of trauma. So when I would say to you all, I'm so glad you're here because you are the future of a lot of this kind of information. If that is the kind of story that you are covering, you have to know that specific event, a decent proportion of those people are going to go on to have these kinds of symptoms. And if they last long enough, or if they're re-traumatized in the process of you saying, but I need more graphic details, I need you to repeat that many times, I need
more colorful quotes,
more
right?
Colorful, then
walk me through moment to moment. The shooter was walking down the hall, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Right?
Could you say that again? What do you remember? Try to remember, especially if the subject that you're interviewing is saying in various ways, either with their body language or their facial expression, or what they're saying, I'm overwhelmed. I really don't want to. We used to think in my field, it's good to get them to talk. No matter who they are, it's good to get them to talk, even as a therapist. But now we understand that there's a subset. If they don't want to talk, then making them talk is actually more likely to make them develop symptoms. So you actually...
So in other words, you should take them at what they say at face value, but if they're not interested, as Dave was saying before, you don't push.
Also beyond just the facial expressions and the physical expressions, we've also blatantly said stop and still done. Yes, but who, like when you watch them die with your own eyes, who died the bloodiest, do you think? And we'll say something along the lines of, all right, that's enough, thank you very much. And they'll say, yes, but how did you watch them die? Who bled out the saddest? And that actually, so I was having a group discussion here at Columbia, and I was actually consistently being berated with questions about how awful it must feel, and apologies for how awful you must feel. What people don't realize, and you touched on this so well and put it into words I really couldn't, is the thing that has really made me feel traumatized is not sitting in a room thinking that somebody was going to come in and shoot my brother and I. It's the after part. everything that happened after, everybody cornering you and, you know, telling you how bad you feel. You know how to make somebody feel bad? Tell them how sorry you are over and over and over again. Because if somebody is starting to look uncomfortable when you're talking about the mass shooting they were there for, they're probably uncomfortable. General rule of thumb.
Kenneth Preston, I want you to take us back in time to understand what the Russia press was like in those first few weeks outside of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas throughout Parkland. Depict this for us. What were journalists doing? What was the situation looking like?
Sure, and that kind of relates to the question you asked earlier about the suicides, which I want to touch on in a second. But I mean, there was obviously a rush of media to get in to understand, you know, what these students were all about, what this march was, you know. But there was some, you know, obviously integrity in the process, but there was a lot of it that was really awful. I have a video of one of the injured leaving the hospital with bandages still around her legs, being chased by the press down the street. There was just a wave of whether it be journalists or professional activists, folks from across the country that came, put a spotlight on these students, and really, you know, for a while gave them a platform. And then the moment it was no longer relevant, disappeared. Right, and that's kind of how we got what we were talking about earlier, because, you know, Lisa Olson, whose son was shot at the school, and I went to the school board a number of times and talked about the fact that, you know, there were dozens and dozens of kids who watched their friends murdered. Right? There were dozens of kids who had to step over the bodies of their classmates, and they are not receiving. I mean, they went back to school 2 weeks after, you know, watching this happen. There were not adequate mental health services. Students were asked, like Cam was saying, to recall the details over and over and over by counselors. And in the process of trying to figure out what was going on and writing my report, I was talking to a girl named Sydney, and, you know, getting the details from her, and she had told me a little bit about, you know, the pain that she was going through, being the best friend of Meadow, one of the students that was killed. And a few weeks after one of our conversations, she took her own life. And I remember being at her burial, thinking, I mean, it was so clear to me why that had happened. The day after her burial, another student named Calvin took his own life. And the media sort of descended in and had these salacious headlines of, you know, these two suicides tear a community apart, shatter a community. But no one ever, they wanted to act surprised. But there was never a question of how it happened. Right? There was never a question of what preceded that. Whether in some ways, some of that coverage and that uplifting of students and an immediate drop of them when they were no longer relevant, whether that had anything to do with the sort of struggles that students were facing after the fact. So, in many ways, the coverage was important, and it gave so many of us a platform. And in other ways, you know, students didn't know what to do with themselves and how to deal with themselves when there was no longer camera in their face, when there were no longer people there to talk to them because they were being paid to talk to them. So it was a media circus, and in some ways was really helpful to sort of figuring out what happened, but was also problematic.
Dr. Saltzman, Kenny has talked about, you and I have discussed ad nauseum, this idea of suicide contagion. And I don't want to ascribe, sort of as an activist ascriber of what was going on in that community when those two really unfortunate, tragic incidents took place, those suicides. But I wonder if you would sort of couch in terms that our audience could understand, what is this idea of contagion? And once we've done that, Judith Matloff, I want to talk about ways that we can smartly tell stories, and there are regulations around this, to prevent and curtail this spreading of negative thinking or negative cognitive reactions, because we've got a lot of power in media,
Yes.
and sometimes it can be wrongly used. So tell us a little bit about contagion.
Well, I just to your point, you have tremendous power in media. I think sometimes it's not understood. The public gets a lot of their information, medical information, mental health information from the media, whether it's a drama. I mean, I realize that you're reporting news, but media in general, everything from fictional shows to the news, is they are much more likely to get their information from you all than from me. And so what you do report hopefully in terms of accuracy, and also a sensitivity to the idea that, the social psychology construct that people do essentially gather information emotionally and behaviorally from others in close proximity, and depending on their connection, and that could be purely an emotional connection, how they read that person and feel either identified with that person in some way, or that person doing something gave them permission to do something themselves. This is a real phenomenon of contagion. Obviously, it's not like a bacterial contagion where you can, catch it like a germ, but you do catch an emotion or an idea or the desire to commit a behavior, and that is sort of behind things like mass hysterias, where large groups, have some sort of behavior going on and it seems to spread. And unfortunately, this has clearly been true in various mental health areas, suicide being one of them. I think there's also concern about, frankly, shooters getting the idea because the media has perhaps made it clear that, to them at least, that they can gain a certain amount of infamy from committing such a heinous act. And so I think the media just have to think about, so why, for example, in suicide, do people get the idea? Well, someone's sitting out there, they may have depression or another mental illness, they have thought about suicide, but they have certain inhibitions that have kept them from doing it. They see somebody, either somebody they connect with, like my fellow student who is undergoing the same sort of suffering that I am, and they say to themselves, this person lowered my inhibition about taking that way out.
A clinician I know calls this putting it on their list of options, or as you've said to me, putting it higher up on the list if it was already.
Because the inhibition, like, I shouldn't do that because maybe it will get better, or I will find a way to get better, or maybe my family will feel terrible, whatever might be keeping them from it. That inhibition might be removed from the moment somebody else said, it's okay to do, essentially. And this is even more of a problem contagion-wise when it's a celebrity that people think feel they admire or they identify with in some way, and they say, well, my goodness, if they could not, with all their resources, have another way, then probably I don't have another way. And I have permission, if they can have permission to do this, I can have permission to do this.
The data has evidenced what you're saying. The classic example being the really terrible suicide of Robin Williams a few years ago, and the numbers skyrocketed in the following 6 months.
That, and for example, when the show 13 Reasons Why came out, and I was asked often about what I thought of it, I said, this is a terrible idea. This is, in certain ways, even though it's fiction, it is still, many of people are watching it, glamorizes suicide in a certain way, and they're going to be copycats. And in fact, it took months to put that data together, but indeed, there was a big spike after that show. So I think what you as journalists have to know is there are certain things that tip people off. You never want to talk about the method, okay? Because that, we now know, actually makes people think about that as a method, or it gives them permission for that method. The gory details. You state somebody died by suicide. It's a method of death, and it shouldn't be more glorious than that or more intricate than that.
And I know
or people are suggestible.
Lexicon issues, died by suicide versus committed suicide, right? That's another thing.
Yeah, exactly. Died by suicide is preferable because committed sounds like you achieved something, you did something.
It also vilifies it, because committed, I feel as though that's something you do that's a crime, whereas people who have died by suicide are victims of something that appears to be them, and it's important also not to characterize them as somebody who's done something wrong. They haven't, they've fallen victim to something.
Alfonso, did you want to contribute something? And then I really do want to get Professor Madloff in, because I've got some questions around ethics. But Alfonso, go ahead.
Definitely. I don't want to take anything away from the concept of contagion, especially in the case of suicide, but I think there's a correlation between what Kenny was speaking on and what she was mentioning. In my personal story, I have to say that, and because we are talking about the responsibility of media and journalism when it comes to covering tragedies, I could not stress enough how horrible the media covered my school, the shooting I was part of. In my personal case, because I was outspoken and speaking on certain policies that I'd like to see, it's unbelievable how much harassment, name-calling, heckling, insults the media has thrown, at least in my way. I'm sure Cameron could attest to that. It's absolutely ridiculous. If you want a community to consider suicide as an option, try bringing them up to the point of almost fiction, saying that the most important thing that has ever happened in your town and in your life was that 17 people were murdered. And then the second that it's not relevant enough for you, you're not getting that juicy headline where you're getting coverage and numbers, you just leave. Journalism is certainly a very intricate profession, and I couldn't begin to understand it. But I think that there's a responsibility that comes when you cover people who are at risk, who are considering these options, who are in a community where death is so fresh. The building is still there. The windows are boarded up because there were bullet holes in them, and the kids are still going to school there. If someone doesn't want to give you an interview, don't be like the people who are near me. Don't say fuck you. I know this is kind of crazy, but there's a certain responsibility that there is to journalism. And when people are definitely struggling, don't make the problems worse. She beautifully went over what it's like to have to retell the same story over and over again, how it feels that it's ingrained in your brain, and there's a certain way that you tell it. Everyone has their own way, but do you know how absolutely terrible someone feels when they have to describe in intricate detail why people died?
A BuzzFeed reporter called me selfish for not explaining how the shooting went down. And I said, "Ooh, but I wasn't there. I was really far away." And she said, "Yeah, but how did it happen?" And I dismissed her, and she said, "Well, that's very selfish of you."
That is just an example of the way journalists have treated us.
I don't think she went to
That's what
the
I'm
I don't think she went to the J school.
So, but just to carry on this point, I mean, in my case with Cameron, when we were at least in activism, and we were spending most of our time dedicating everything that we had to our cause and our movement and what we believed in, do you know how absolutely tiring it is to spend your entire day only speaking about a tragedy that happened 3 days ago? How are you supposed to rationalize it? How are you supposed to at least feel at ease or calm enough to retell the story in a way that is accurate, realistic, isn't fictional? It's almost impossible.
There was also an NBC reporter who was tweeting at one of the kids in our school asking for an interview during the shooting. One of the kids tweeted a picture of the under the desk circumstance in which he had found himself, and an NBC News reporter actually commented on the tweet, "Hey, I'm a reporter with NBC News. Any chance you have a second to get on the phone?" And the person said, "Hey, we don't know if we're safe yet." And they said, "All right, great, give me a call when you can. I'm going to DM you." And that looks like it's out of a dark comedy about school shootings, but it was real. When I had first seen those tweets, I thought that they were actually doctored, but that's a real thing. And it's not certain we're to be afraid of NBC lately. But
Judith Matloff, we really need some analysis on press ethics here. You've heard so much. I wonder what your analysis is of this. What's your response?
I think we can all agree that that was not very ethical press behavior, and I'm really sorry that my colleagues behaved in such a way. What is particularly chilling, you have to be quiet during a lockdown, during the shooting, and the fact that they were actually putting your lives in danger is just really appalling.
You know about this. Tell us a little bit about the safety trainings you've done. This is really an area that you're incredibly knowledgeable about.
Yeah, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't train students with school shootings. I train correspondents that go into dangerous areas, but there are a lot of correlations. In fact, as a matter of fact, I was speaking with one of your classmates, Ryan, the other day about whether the lockdown drills that you guys had, whether he felt it prepared him for the day, and he had some pretty chilling things to say about those drills that he underwent. You can never fully prepare somebody for the day that it happens, and that's not my specialty, which is school lockdowns, but I want to get back to the ethical issues rather than training, because I think that's really what we're here for. One thing which I have noticed is a shift within, when we talk about the media, we're not monolithic. There's Fox, and then there's The Nation, and then there's BuzzFeed. But what I have seen a shift generally in mainstream media is a move towards not putting so much attention on the perpetrators. And I see that as a really, really heartening sign. I mean, obviously, you probably do need to name the perpetrator at some point, but refraining from showing their social media posts posing with guns and, very inflammatory messages and whatnot, and really focusing more on the community and not doing anything that might glorify in the eyes of certain work people the behavior of the perpetrator and then lead to more copycat attacks. So I see that as a promising sign, but without a doubt, we have further to go in the media in terms
You
of.
can do the names and the faces in the article. Pardon me, you can do the names in the articles, but
Right.
putting the names and the faces on these headlines.
Yeah.
I mean, the Boston bomber. What cover of a magazine wasn't he on the cover of Time magazine?
Rolling Stone.
Rolling Stone. The media inadvertently is one of the greatest mass shooting generators in the world. Because what you get is a bunch of people saying, this is the mark I can leave on the world. The videos that the shooter from my school put out before the school, these haunting videos that for some stupid reason I watched, he talked about how people don't know him, but after this, everybody will know his name. Every single person in journalism needs to take that into account. It's serious what I'm saying. Everybody will know my name. And you know what? A lot of people do. He became a household name for a while. Everybody saw his face, and he got what he wanted. Everybody knew who he was. Everybody knew that that guy who felt as though he had made no impact on the world impacted an entire country. So if you're somebody else who has these twisted thoughts, suddenly you realize you're going to become a celebrity. Your face is going to be everywhere, and those people love the infamy.
Kenneth Preston, let's get you involved in this. Thoughts on naming the shooter versus not naming the shooter? I know you've got some strong views on this.
I think it's incredibly easy not to, right? And one of the more disturbing things, I was talking to one of the lead investigators at a local paper, and we were talking about contagion and how, whether it leads to more suicides or encourages mass shooters, and naming them or talking about the details of suicide. He said, yes, I believe that. Yes, I've seen the studies. I'm still going to print it. Right? To me, to know what that spurs and to continue to do it is just horrific. But right, there's a certain newsworthiness in understanding why they did it, right? And understanding the warning signs, and understanding how many times the police visited his house, and understanding that this kid had made threats that were never followed up on, that this kid was drinking gasoline and cutting his wrist prior to this. Those are details and warning signs that maybe would be helpful to know to prevent the next one. I don't know why it's so newsworthy to know his name.
Well, I want to push back on that for a second.
Sure.
And Judith Matloff, I want to do it with you. If I play devil's advocate and say, well, it is newsworthy. This is a member of a community who engaged in a really atrocious act, and I think the community has a right to know who the shooter was, the assailant. Is there a happy medium? Like, where does the press fall on this? Is there a clear guideline? I don't really think there is.
Well, you can name them, but don't glorify them. Name them, identify them, but don't keep naming them in a gratuitous way. Just give the information that is actually essential to informing the public, but don't go into the salacious details and whatnot of, the worst nature, of their nature.
What happens, Dr. Gil-Salt, when we start to perpetuate these images of people, putting them up on television, plastering them on the covers of newspapers and magazines, and we give them a platform to espouse their views after engaging in such an unspeakable act? What happens to them?
To other people out there who are thinking about this? Well, first of all, let me just say, I hope that increasingly, I think it's starting to happen, but increasingly, that journalists will accurately portray the important, you said, what's the important information? What are the important warning signs? So, most people who commit these crimes are not mentally ill. And in fact, the mentally ill are more likely to be victims of violent crimes. And that if you're going to talk about warning signs, unfortunately, even psychiatrists can't spot the warning signs. So, there's not necessarily been such a clear-cut way for us to, and what ends up happening is that journalists go back and sort of look at the family life and talk to the family members and make them a person. Do you know what I'm saying? So make them a person who maybe, to some degree, do we feel sympathetic toward them, or do we feel interested in them, or are we like, oh wow, I could relate in any sort of way, and that's what you don't want. You don't want other people who are out there saying, I'm angry, I'm lonely, I hate women, I hate the world, I didn't get to be, all of the things that I wanted to be, which isn't necessarily mental illness or the kind of mental illness that would come to the attention of a professional. And this person is now pictured, they're talking about their family, they're talking about their background, they're naming them a million times. Again, that's the contagion, but that's
It
what you
sounds
don't
as though
want.
this is violence contagion, in effect.
It is.
If we talk about
Any
suicide
sort of
contagion.
behavior you can be disinhibited from committing, and to some degree, I've seen. I would say I agree. It's been better recently that more journalists have been saying, I'm not going to whatever name them again, and that's good. But when they do it, they usually say, I'm not going to, because this is the right way to do it. And they say that many times, which to some degree actually ups the mysteriousness of this person. In other words, really what you're trying to do is sort of suck all the emotional energy out of the perpetrator, if I will. In other words, I've heard Anderson Cooper say many times, I'm not going to name this person because it's really not good to name this person. So I'm only going to name this person once. And we've decided it's not good to name the person because, and I have great respect for Anderson, but I'm just saying when you say it many times, you create a different kind of aura around the person. So really the goal to some degree is, if you keep this idea of what makes someone want to imitate, is you want to make them disappeared enough to not be imitatable, essentially. And so whether we're talking about suicide or we're talking about violence, I would say that's what you want to have in your mind when you're thinking about what you're writing and what you're reporting.
And with school shooters specifically, another thing I see a lot is people just instantly talking about how they were bullied, and they suddenly victimize the shooter, talking about how much of an outcast they felt like, and doing all these different things that very quickly try to make people sympathetic toward the shooter for the emotional aspect of the story.
I want to open this question up to our 3 students, then we're going to do questions from our students, from my classmates. This is obviously about learning, so I think we can learn best with some examples. Cameron, Alfonso, Kenny, take a moment, and among the 3 of you, share with us a time that in covering Parkland, we, the collective press, got it right, or perhaps something we did wrong, and what we can learn from that.
I mean, if I could go first on this might sound a little bit laughable, but at least for me, some of the best coverage I feel like I experienced was with Fox News, which I know is funny, but it's because for once, the coverage was about the political views we were spouting, the change that we want to create to not have this happen again. It was just debating policy. I would rather have someone try to discredit me for my age, my views, the trauma I just experienced, because that is certainly less traumatizing and more valuable for my time than talking about what happened over and over and over and over again. I can't explain how many times I've told the same story, more than 3,000 times. But when you're actually debating with someone on live television about why your policy is actually going to work, or naming statistics, and your audience is that age range of people who do actually have an effect on this country and the way they vote, it is certainly more valuable. I definitely felt more appreciated. I felt like I actually was an adult who could aspire positions without being babied to, without being talked to as if I were some sort of child who just experienced this awful thing and that I couldn't even think. I definitely have to say that feeling comfortable is important when covering someone who's experienced a tragedy, but you don't want to coddle a person to the point where they feel disrespected. And I will certainly admit I felt disrespected by most journalists in almost every single way. They talked to me, the way they looked down to me, the way that they would harass me. I had people come outside of my house. I had to cancel my phone. I'm sure Cameron did the same thing. It's absolutely ridiculous to spread someone's phone number around when they're a 16-year-old boy and you're a 50-year-old man who's trying to get them to talk to them in a secluded area with nobody else. It's ridiculous. I just have to say journalistic standards and integrity are extremely important, but also consider the fact that I was 16. I was a child.
You were a man, Alfonso. I knew you were 16.
I was a child. It's unbelievable to me, the harassment, the anger, the vitriol. If I already experienced those things in a literal sense with the tragedy that's happening, also verbally from people who disagree with me, it's not the best approach to come to these people who are experiencing so much pain, so much trauma, so much emotional disasters happening around their lives, families being broken, people not knowing what to do with themselves, crying, constant crying in funerals. Maybe, just maybe, treat them like a decent human being with an ounce of respect. Don't harass them. Don't question them about their experience. Just let them talk it out if they want to. Don't pressure people. Have some respect.
I mean, one of the most interesting types of reporters that I've encountered, and this has happened a lot, is the reporters who want to become the story. The reporters who are so desperate to make a name for themselves that they suddenly make the stories that are about school shootings about them. I had that a lot with younger reporters who were really trying to get into this profession. And I understand that this must be really special for you that this school in Florida got shot up, but it was all the time I'd see people just talking about how they felt about it. They were like, well, I think, okay, great, you're a journalist and you're reporting on this. And Alfonso, I agree with you about Fox. I'm not going to come out here and discuss my love for Fox News because, this is for another panel, but I obviously think that they're horrible. But I never felt infantilized. I never felt condescended to. If you're a journalist and you're trying to talk, and you're talking to your source and you're trying to let them know how smart and great and powerful a journalist you are, you're reporting on yourself and how wonderful you are. And congratulations, I bet you're great. But the fact of the matter is, we got, by a lot of different media outlets that I generally respect, we got infantilized. They were talking about how youth empower youth. They were talking about how these kids, wow, you kids, you're just kids, you're so special. Oh my God, you're so smart for kids. Oh my God, you kids should be kids. And we were just sitting there saying, we're trying to talk about how to not get more people shot up in this country. And you're just getting all excited about the activism aspect. Guess what? I'd rather be the complete loser that I was supposed to be if nobody got killed than deal with this, all right? I don't think that this is exciting or good or special. The fact that the youth is standing up is not a good thing. We should be sitting down like the idiots that we are. You should hear Alfonso and I talk when microphones aren't on. We are fools. Kenneth is a fool in different ways, but people liked to tell this story as though it was a story and not something that just exists. They tried to turn it into this sort of narrative, like this wonderful book, Devil in the White City. This became a story that had already been told before it ended. Because the story goes on every day. The kids still go to the school. We still have panic attacks. And it comes at the worst times. I went back to Stone and Douglas a couple weeks ago to go see a really bad play. And wow, drama really tanked when I left. But I went back and I thought that there was going to be some sort of catharsis there. I thought I was going to stand in front of the freshman building, which is the building that got shot up, and I was going to say, this all makes sense. This is my journey home. Sorry if any of you have to do the core curriculum here and you know what the journey home is. But I thought that there was going to be something there, and there wasn't. And I realized that this is never going to end, because suddenly I'll be going to see a movie and I'll sit on the train and I'll remember how everybody died and I'll tear up. Because you don't get to pick those things, and journalists have tried to tell our story for us in the sense that they think that they can turn us into these ideas. And we wanted it in a sense. We wanted to be treated like these personalities because we knew that that was the way we were going to connect with people around the country. I had to have a personality. I had to be Cameron, and I didn't much like it in retrospect, but at the time, we needed people to look at the students who were on TV and say, that could be my kid. That was the big thing. Forgetting politics, forgetting all these different things, the main message we wanted to send to people in the country was, whether you agree with us, whether you disagree with us, that could be my kid. And you know what? I was just like that in high school. This kid is tweeting about gun control policies and what happened at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, but he's also tweeting about the fact that he has a poster of Patti LuPone in his room, but it's not weird, okay? He's cool. And I was a dumb loser theater kid in high school too. So whether or not I think that we need to ban AR-15s, I get it, and these are kids who just want to make I'll stop soon, I promise you. So one of the things that I have to say, something I wish I knew going into this, if I could magically teleport myself back to right before I was about to turn this tragedy into a story, I would have said, get ready, because a lot of journalists are going to come up to you and they're not going to be reporting on what happened. They're going to be reporting on how they think the most interesting way to express what happened is. And that's not the story. I was a disaster, falling apart at the seams, rapid cycling through bipolar disorder, and thinking about who would show up at my funeral, and wondering what would happen if I just disappeared, which ends up being the early thoughts for suicide. But I'm the youth, so I'm gonna go up and youth everybody, really youth, and that's what we got. We became fiction, and if you know me personally, you'll know that I'm too ridiculous to exist, but they turned us into a story. And that ended up completely entering our lives in all these different ways. And all these kids at the school, I mean, forget those of us who were audacious enough to stand in front of television the day after. The kids in the school in general, they weren't themselves anymore. They were the Parkland kids. And boy, do we feel bad for the Parkland kids. It's like all the sympathy ended up being forced upon us. People called us, that's another big thing, people called us victims and survivors. There were kids who walked out of school and cleaned the blood off of their shoes that day. And yet, we were scared. We didn't know if we were going to get killed. We were close to what was happening. But calling us victims, when there are families who are looking at the empty bedrooms in their houses every single day and realizing that they only got to hold their baby for 14 years, you're calling me a victim of anything? I'm a victim of one thing, and that's my stupid brain. And I'm going to be living with that forever. So you can't turn this into your story. You're telling people what happened. You're not telling people what you want them to hear.
Kenny, I'm going to speak to you for 1 minute, and then Dr. Salz, and then we're going to wrap up this section. I want to read you some guidelines, but then we'll do audience questions.
Sure. So, a lot of the time, I mean, after these suicides, every step of the way after something went wrong, everyone asks, what could have been done differently? What should we have said differently? And I think the answer to that is nothing. I think what everyone should have done that nobody did was listen, right? To treat these students as if they were the victims of a mass shooting, to treat these students as if they had just watched their friends been massacred, right? That seems like a crazy point, I guess, to some folks, but there was a certain sense of, even when they're coming to cover and really asking how these students were doing, there was a clear agenda in every one of those interviews, regardless of what outlet it was. They were always looking to get to an answer, whether that was gun control or school safety or pointing the finger at one specific person. It was there was always a certain sense that these students were props on late night or daytime television or Anderson Cooper than kids who were dealing with the most intense trauma that I think you can deal with. So I think that was one of the biggest mistakes, and I think the second biggest mistake that really should have been done better was trying to figure out what the hell happened, right? I mean, these parents and these students, to me it is a tragedy that of Cam and Alfonso's names, right? There is no reason that a student who had their friends murdered, who a parent that lost children, somebody who was shot, there is no reason that they should have to fight to solve their own crimes, that they should have to fight and speak to the Congress on reforms that needed to be made. They should have been grieving, right? They should have been able to get on with their lives and it's so strange. Andrew, one of the parents, tells me all the time, things that you don't think about. He said, when you lose a child, typically in the weeks and months that follow, you're told, I'm sorry for your loss. He said, now every time I hear it, it makes me angry. It's been nearly 2 years and I'm hearing, I'm sorry for your loss. And it's because of the fact that, there was never an understanding of the trauma that these students felt. And there was also a sense that, none of us are policy experts. None of these parents are congressional correspondents. They don't know, they had no idea what it was like to be in something like this, or what it was like to try and explain the solutions to this, which none of us had. We had to learn, and I think there was really a weight on the students in the community to solve an issue that wasn't their responsibility to solve.
Dr. Salz.
I was just gonna say two things, and that is for you journalists, something like this happening is such a complex and long story. I mean, to some degree, for many of you, like a lifelong story. And yet, I think, many news outlets, the assignment is you're assigned to basically a very short story, right? Please tell me what happened in a soundbite. Tell me the soundbite over and over again, and then we've got it, and we're out. And really, I think, keeping in mind that when something of this magnitude goes on, that's this complex, to think about it as a long story. It's not a short story, and things can be handled very differently in a long story, both in terms of how you talk with the people involved in an ongoing way, and you're not sort of trying to force them immediately to tell you things over and over, but also in the way that you can handle the complexity if it's a long form story in terms of the mental health elements. I think can be very different. The other thing is that I think often when you're put on a story like this, you're afraid too. I mean, this is scary, scary stuff. And I think reporters, journalists come and they feel like they're not supposed to be afraid or showing they're afraid or even tap into the fact that they are afraid. And I think that really limits any ability for you to read what's going on in the people that you're questioning. So I would just say, in addition to the fact that it probably is obvious. I mean, if you're saying no, I'm done, I don't want to talk anymore, saying anything else is, I think, ethically unconscionable. But you may not even have somebody who's able to articulate, no, I don't want to talk anymore. But I think if you as a journalist tap into how you feel when you are in this conversation, and if you're aware of feeling more afraid or more, what you're feeling may be very much a mirror, how you're feeling, but also a mirror of what your subject is feeling. And should be able to provide some clues about it's time to stop asking. Don't force this person forward. Don't ask it again, because you're essentially re-traumatizing them. And but you can use your own feeling states, I think, as a barometer. Unfortunately, when you become increasingly afraid, but you stay in the questioning period, you're going to do things that are bad for you, but they're bad for them. So some of these ridiculous things that you said happened to you, I think sometimes they partially happen because the person is walled off from their own feeling state, and they're just like, I can't even look at this, so I'm just gonna, it's basically, in my parlance, we call that counterphobic. They're afraid of going in the swimming pool, so they jump off the high dive.
Yeah, just to that point, I understand what you're saying about someone's emotions and trying to relate to the person you're trying to talk to portray what actually happened or the right story or the best thing that you could possibly do. But I mean, I think in our case, there was a certain line that was violated beyond a degree of acceptance. Across the street from our school, there were, I believe, 30, 40 news trucks with anchors and everyone trying to get an interview on kids who were crying because they just got out of a massacre.
Another thing that I saw was journalists. One thing you'll understand is kids from a small town, forget kids, people from a small town will look at the news and they will look at the concept of being on the news as something very, very special and something, and therefore they look at journalists as though they are some sort of higher class of people, and journalists will exploit that to get people to say things. I'm a journalist, you should listen to me and you should work with me because I'm going to tell your story. I'm a journalist, don't worry, I'm a journalist. And that's where you see most of the exploitation, in my opinion.
Well, I want to wrap up this section because we're going to do the audience, but what I want to tell you guys is there's a great resource that I was looking into that I've been reading a lot about. And in fact, the Columbia Department of Psychiatry was one of the leading groups of researchers that put this together. It's called reportingonsuicide.org. And obviously the name sort of does it justice, but in fact, I think there are some rules and some sort of ideals that we can all aspire to, which apply to much more than just suicide. For instance, they break it down in recommendations. Instead of this, do this. One of them is, instead of big or sensational headlines or prominent placement, inform the audience without sensationalizing suicide and minimizing prominence. That sounds like a pretty good idea for most stories that we cover. Instead of including photos or videos of the location or the method of death, the grieving family, friends, memorials, or funerals, instead use a photograph of someone from school or work or a family photo. Include the hotline logo or the local crisis phone numbers. instead of using terms to describe suicides or really any kind of mental health issue as an epidemic or skyrocketing or other really strong evocative terms, consider things like looking at CDC data and using non-sensational words to go with it, like rise or higher, which explains the phenomenon without really couching it in these emotive ways. So I think we've done a really solid job for the first hour, and I know that I'm curious to hear what my classmates, I mean, there's a room full of journalists, have to say. So I really do encourage all of you to get up and ask candid questions. We've got a microphone there in the center, and Christy, I want to, if you come up and grab the microphone at the podium, Christy will cover this side of the room, and then for all of you on, I guess, your right or left, you can use that mic there. So why don't you do this? Start by telling us your name, and if you have a particular panelist that you want to address your question to, or if it's for the group, and we can sort of sort it out from there.
Hi. How's that better? Okay. Hi, I'm Lucas Woods. Thanks so much for coming. This is really, really interesting. So, many of us are here studying journalism because we want to serve the public. We want to serve, this country and communities, all communities, local communities, like Parkland, right? And we feel like we want to do this. We feel like we want to tell people's stories, in order to serve the greater good, right? Educate the public about gun violence, for example. Now, it doesn't seem like much has happened with legislation and policy on the national level. It doesn't seem like anything ever is going to happen. And that, so I just want to hear from you. We've talked a lot about how, unethically many reporters are treated and how negatively this affected you, but mainly to the students, or former students, current students at college. What good, if anything, came out of all this coverage?
Yeah, for just a second, let me. Sorry to some of you here that I think this may have been a somewhat disheartening conversation because we've taken about an hour and a half to talk about everything that the journalist did wrong, and took about an hour, just sort of crapping on the profession. But the truth of the matter is there was so much good that was done at the local level in Parkland. I think there were a lot of mistakes at the national level. I think it got better towards the end. But certainly in the reporting and coverage that some friends and I did and that the Sun Sentinel did, I mean, there would be no grand jury right now. There would be no investigations going on right now. There would be no, substantial evidence that came up of why this happened, the mistakes that were made, and the implementations that were made after this to fix this, from firing corrupt officials and folks who facilitated an environment in which this could happen. So lots of mistakes, really terrible things. But, you guys got it right sometimes. So I think there's, should be credit where credit is due.
I think the point here is focus on policy. Don't focus on re-traumatizing people in their personal stories. Focus on the bigger issue, which is that the AR-15s, people going around and shooting up kids in schools, that's really the issue, gun control.
Well,
Go ahead.
and also you're not telling a story because you want people to read it and say that guns are the issue. I think guns are the issue, in case you can't tell. But your job is to tell a story. Your job is to say, these kids got shot and the school wasn't protected. Thank you very much. And one more thing I'd like to say is, again, journalists have made this a story and have put this in front of the entire country, and we couldn't have done it without journalism. But I cannot stress this enough. So much of what I've seen is journalists getting really, really pumped about how great a person they are for saving the entire world because they're a journalist. You have a job, and it's a job that can do some good, and it's a job that can also do a lot of bad. Do good, be glad you're doing your job well, and don't get on some sort of high horse about it, because that has led to every bad journalist I've dealt with is a journalist whose story is them, not us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Angie.
A little short, so. I want to thank you all for coming, especially the students, and for rehashing your feelings and your experiences yet again in front of the bunch of journalists. I guess my question is sort of an offshoot of that, but more about your feelings. Had journalists aside, has anyone approached you in a way that you thought was refreshing, that you were like, okay, like I can speak to this person, I actually feel you know, like they're gonna listen and they're not gonna make it about them and think that they're on this high horse.
I mean, I have to say, definitely. I know this is crazy, but I think most people experience times where they have to consolidate someone at some point in their life, and I've reluctantly found out that the best way to help someone who's going through a tough time is just to listen, to try to be understanding, try to make them feel a little bit better. Obviously, don't talk about yourself. I know this seems like common human decency, but I think this was one of the biggest issues when covering Parkland. I really do think that journalists, even though obviously they created the story, I wouldn't be here right now if it weren't for journalists. And just to piggyback off what Kenny said, you guys do a lot of good. I just have had extremely negative experiences with journalists. And if you want to do your job better, if you want to make the person you're talking to just feel slightly better, I remember those times where journalists would come up to me and it'd be like a sigh of relief, because the first thing that they'd say is, the first thing they said wasn't, how did your friends die? Because they know, we all know. I think some of the best journalism, some of the times that I opened up the most, I was the most open and genuine, was when someone would just come up to me, ask me if they could have an interview. The first question they'd ask, off camera, would be, how are you doing? How do you feel today? Is it better than yesterday? I know a lot of people might be a little reluctant to try to be so personable with someone they have to basically get an interview from, but people who open up to you, it's because they feel comfortable. It's because they feel like they're in the right environment. And if I don't know you, I've never met you, I have no idea who you are as a person or what you believe in, and the first question you ask me is, how did your friends die? It's not effective.
And just from a personal level, because who here knows when you're going to be the next person whose friend died, or when you're going to be the next person who dies. I mean, these days, the collection of people who are mass shooting survivors are connected to one is getting bigger and bigger. So just from a personal level, I met these two girls here, Sarah and Victoria, who aren't here tonight, so they aren't my friends anymore. But we were friends until tonight, and they had seen me speak at a conference for their Jewish group. They had seen me speak at the BBYO conference, and I met them and I was hanging out with them, and I was hanging out with Gabe, who's videotaping this now on his iPhone. I say videotape. And can you not, Gabe? And I was hanging out with them, we were all talking, we were together for an hour, and then they said, I mentioned that I was at BBYO because they had mentioned BBYO, and they said, oh, we saw you speak. And I said, wow, I was able to make a connection with somebody before they talked about the fact that they knew that my friends were killed. That's really great. It's almost as though you don't need to apologize. People who have been through something, generally speaking, from those that I've met, do not need you to apologize to them within the first 10 seconds you guys meet for them to like you. Generally speaking, the longer you go without apologizing for it, the more comfortable they'll become, because you feel a lot better in your identity if you don't think it's consistently tied to the murder of a lot of people. Like, I meet so many new people, and it makes me so, it makes it so hard for me to meet people. I have so much trouble trusting people, because I will meet so many folks they do it from a really good place. Because they don't know what to say. Because what do you say to somebody like that? But I'm so much more comfortable when people have no idea who I am, where I come from, or anything. It's such a sigh of relief.
And another thing is, one of my favorite questions in the world is, what do you want to talk about? What do you think is important for us to talk about? Because I can guarantee you, those students you're talking to, who are living this on an everyday basis, right? Whose experience is far greater than anything you can research to form a question. That student, that parent is going to give you answers to questions you would have never thought to ask. So I think it's really important to figure out what's on the mind of the community.
Dr. Gelsholtz, how do you make people, one, feel comfortable, let's talk about body language, things you can say, and two, the psychology of feeling? I mean, Dave Cullen really said it best, you gotta make people feel safe. So what does that look like psychologically? What's going on in the brain? What's going on inside the body for people as they can ease into an interview and start to feel safe?
Right. Well, I think some of the things have been said in the sense that listening is really important. I think usually when people come in and say insinuate in some way, I'm here to listen to you. I would like to listen to the way you want to tell your story, how you want to tell your story. I think assuring people that if they want to stop, that's okay. I think there's often a tremendous pressure to, like, I need this, I need all of this, I need it now. It doesn't feel safe if you feel like if I become upset or, I don't want to, then I feel caged in. I think letting people know that, you can stop, you can come back later, you can talk later, you can not talk for a while, is okay. I think not physically moving in on them. I mean, there's a reason that, when someone comes to therapy, the chairs are placed a certain distance apart. You don't want someone to feel that you're in their physical space, that you're in their face, that you're sort of trying to get literally in their head. So there's a certain amount of, give them a little physical space, give them a chance to relax, ask them if they need anything. Some people are going to want to tell you their story, but they might cry while they're telling you their story, and they still might want to continue telling their story, but you're going to get them some tissue, you're going to get them a glass of water, you're going to, to some degree, right, you're asking something of them. You're asking them to be vulnerable and reveal something of themselves. So are you going to a little take care of them? That's essentially what I would say. Not in a seductive way, like I'm going to so take care of you that, you give me everything even if you don't want to, but in a sort of, supportive, kind of caretaking, non-pressured sort of way.
Forgive me if I sound like a contrarian to this whole idea, but it is very important to remember that if you find yourself having to calculate how to make somebody feel comfortable, maybe talk to somebody else. If you're trying to sneak your way into getting somebody to feel something, you can't make people feel stuff.
But I don't think that's at all what Dr. Saltz is implying.
But we saw some blatant examples of people trying to manufacture the feeling of comfort with us, and it was pathetic and dark, and I hope none of them are working.
Which is exactly what you said, that you shouldn't be doing
don't
this
be seductive. It's
intentionally.
not supposed to be seduction, I'm saying, yes.
100%. But remember, if you're trying to make I
Yes.
swear to God, I'm almost done, I promise you. If you try to make somebody feel comfortable, you should probably leave them alone, because they're probably not comfortable.
Yeah.
Thank you to all of you for being here. That actually falls right into the question I was going to ask Alfonso and Cameron. Thank you both for being here. I study documentary film here at the J School, and we have so many different mediums of journalism that we all study here. And it sounds like tonight a lot of the experiences you were talking about to us were related to broadcast and television news. And I was curious what your experiences were after the shooting, speaking to journalists from other mediums.
Oh, we had a documentary. We had a film. Really, the only problem we ever got was physical space, I think. The interviews with documentarians, because they were trying to tell a longer version of the story, which plays into the fact that when you're doing sound bites, it becomes more difficult. But those who were trying to tell a long narrative, really the only problem ever became physical space. People trying to get onto our bus, people trying to get into our office when it didn't make sense. We ended up getting doxxed by Time Magazine and harassed at our office by alt-right people from the internet, which, I genuinely think that if the alt-right is harassing you, you're probably doing something right. But if you're looking into documentary filmmaking, as long as you know the story you're telling and this really plays into the physical comfort aspect, because the camera is much more assertive a thing than a person's face when it gets right up in front of you, especially if you're cripplingly self-conscious like I am. So as long as you understand that physical space is a huge part of this, it's just about telling a story.
Absolutely. Just to sort of say the same thing Cameron said, physical space is extremely important. When we were experiencing, recording and the same sort of things that you do for documentary, when we were doing ours, when we were going around the country, I never minded the camera recording me if I was talking on a stage or speaking on a panel like this, just trying to get a message or a point across makes all the sense in the world, but I understand that documentaries are more in depth. And I think in order to reach that depth, you need a level of comfort with the person you're doing the documentary on. I certainly did not feel comfortable with our documentary crew, because at every turn that they would try to exploit any slightly human moment that we would have that wasn't talking about policy. One time we were going around on bikes because we were just waiting for the bus to start up again because we were at a stop. And for some reason, the crew had to ask us questions in the middle of riding bikes, and we had to pretend like it was such a breathtaking moment to go in Colorado and use a bike. We were just trying to be human. And I know that's a concept that a lot of people don't have to grapple with in everyday life, but at least for us it was. And the bus was not just a bus, it was also our home. Our beds were on the bus, and we would spend most of our days there. So when saying we wouldn't want to speak to the documentary crew and getting resistance and getting fights and wanting to put clips that weren't approved by the people who were actually in the documentary, it seems like you're just trying to tell your own story. And I, at least for me, I would think that for a documentary, you find and develop a story that's actually there.
Yeah, and one other thing I'd say about the documentaries is that people will create create fictional situations with us,
Reality TV.
real situations, and they would just hope that it's slides under and is able people are able to consider it real. But we had documentarians saying, okay, but we need you crying over here. Can you move maybe 20 yards and cry over by this part? That's not it. I get why they did it. I really do, because it's an easier way to tell a story. But that's not how you documentary, and I thought that was more of a given than it was.
Professor Matloff.
Yeah, well, it's all really sobering stuff to take in. I just wanted to broaden it a little bit I don't know how many people here want to do foreign reporting, because there's another layer of complexity, which is cultural appropriateness. And it's something to really think about. When somebody was mentioning giving a tissue, you wouldn't do that in Kashmir. Something that I learned doing an interview with some some people that were undergoing trauma. So I think it gets even more complicated when you're in another country. And what's absolutely critical then when you're interviewing people is that you have a trusted member of their community with them at the time. So you're not just going in with your cameras and whatnot, but you actually have somebody, again, getting back to what David was saying at the beginning, the trust. You have somebody who's very much embedded in that community, who they feel comfortable with when you're interviewing them. And you might even have that person lead the interview and ask the questions on your behalf in a way that's culturally appropriate.
Thank you.
Hi there, tell us your name, your
Hi,
question.
my name is Aaliyah. Thank you very much for your time. Half of our class is not from the United States, and I wanted to ask, did you notice a difference in standards of journalism applied by journalists who come from countries where school mass shootings is not a thing?
As someone who also was on board of the United States, yeah, the answer to your question is absolutely yes. I do have to say that it was sort of heartwarming yet concerning at the same time. In the United States, as we went over, there was a lot of harassment and a lot of push and a lot of effort that was put from a lot of different mediums, at least in our country, to develop the story the way they would want to or do whatever they wanted. At least with international mediums, and I was the Spanish-speaking correspondent because I was born in Spain. I was
Tell them we really loved him. Tell them we really loved him so much.
As that person, right, who would have to flip on a dial, speak 3 different languages, and start talking to 5 different reporters, at least I felt slightly more valued in the international community when being reported on it. Most of the questions were at least on, do you believe in this policy? What do you actually think? And of course, there was a lot of tell us a story of that day, which was inevitable for us at the time, even though rehashing it over and over again is usually not constructive. But I will say that no matter what medium or where they come from or where a reporter is, if you say no to giving a story, most of the time there's going to be pushback from the reporter. And I understand why. You have a story to tell, you have a job. It's undeniable. But instead of pushing back, if someone gives you a no, just be human about it. Try to understand why they didn't. Try to be understanding. And in the international community, I certainly felt like that was stronger with them. In my home country of Spain, a lot of reporters wanted to talk to me because a Spanish person in the United States was doing something, which never happens. So it was a big deal for them. They were so much more respectful and understanding, and at least were concerned about how I was doing. Most of the reporters from Spain would treat me like a human being and ask me, how are you doing today? I saw that last week this event happened and I'm sure it must have been difficult for you. Or, this vote happened in Congress, it must have been tough. But how are you doing? And I think the way that international mediums value mental health should definitely be considered in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, the best interview I did was definitely a BBC Hard Talk, because they actually tried to tell a story and they didn't want anybody to think anything politically. They wanted to tell somebody's story and the story of a greater community. But the other thing I would say, and this is more just a reflection of American politics, is the biggest question we got from every single time we did an international interview, the first thing we heard was, isn't it crazy that this happens? This doesn't happen in my country. This has happened once in my country. And then we got rid of the guns and it stopped happening. And we said, yeah, it's a little weird. That's why we're doing this. But the international journalists were really, really, really respectful to us. I never had a bad experience with one. I think maybe because the media works differently in other countries, I'm not quite sure. But
Yes.
it was all about, yes, because of that. Because it might have been less of a business perspective, but again, I don't know.
And I don't necessarily know that it's that, because I mean, everybody sort of knows that the British media is extremely exploitative. Well,
Here's Morgan's on TV.
yeah, sure. So, I think it was perhaps funny, perhaps tragic, is that foreign journalists tended to conduct interviews with the utmost confusion. Just how in the hell did we get here? Right? Like, it's interesting because I think American journalists will come, have a set prepared of questions, set list of questions, ask them, turn off the lights, get out of there, because I've got another shooting to cover in a week, right? It's I don't know how many mass shootings Anderson Cooper's been to, but these foreign journalists will come and, you know, I remember one just being so confused that, you know, you, 6 years ago, had a couple dozen 5 and 6 year olds mowed down in an elementary school, and I'm having this conversation with you again, right? Like, how? I don't have this in my home country. I don't know other home countries that have this. So I think there's a little more sympathy in that, because they're not quite as desensitized to it as so many American journalists are.
Any other questions? I know we haven't gotten any from this side of the room, but I'm hard pressed to believe everyone over there is too shy. So, any last questions? No? All right, well then what I want to do is wrap up with, oh, you have a question. Okay.
One small procedural question. What would you say to 24-hour newscasts? Because the news just, it might just repeats, because like in some way you have to cover the news to the person who tunes in both at 5 p.m. and 5 a.m. And what would you say to channels who run those, or companies that run those channels?
Yeah, Judith Matloff, I think for this.
Well, I think the insensitivity of the interview technique predates 24-hour news, and I think it, somebody sticking a microphone in front of a grieving mother and asking, how do you feel because your son just died, is not something new. So, unfortunately, 24-hour news does put more pressure on you to produce more and more reports and whatnot, but I think the essence of what we're talking about, which is very, very insensitive reporting and interview technique, predates it.
On the other side of that question, the viewer, I have been known more than a few times to on air say, I would suggest that you turn your TV off. I don't know how they have me back again after that, but because actually it's traumatic to particularly for young people and particularly for children who may be in the room, to see over and over again the same story of the same trauma. Depending on your age and developmental stage, it may appear that something is literally happening over and over again. But even for the adult who knows that's not the case, if you've been exposed to this and then you're seeing it over and over and over again, it absolutely increases your anxiety level, and it increases the likelihood that you'll continue to have symptoms. So
Makes me nervous, and I used to work for CNN. It makes me very
people
nervous.
involved, for you, you were being barraged constantly, obviously, unfortunately, with people not taking no for an answer. But in addition, the coverage was on probably 24/7 around you. And I would have said, or a mental health professional with you probably would have said, better for you not to be viewing, watching, immersed in.
Hi, can I ask a question that's not related to journalism? I'm wondering from Cameron and Alfonso where you think the gun control movement's going now.
Gun control movement's going wherever the media wants it to. I'd say that the gun control movement will continue to be cyclical, right? A bunch of little kids are going to get killed, or a bunch of people at a movie theater, God knows where, you never know these days. A bunch of people are going to get killed, everybody's going to get really riled up. We'll get a couple policies passed at a local level, but, it's American politics, nothing's going to happen. So we can, all everybody's responsibility in this issue. All we can do is our best, and we can't do any more or any less. But I'll tell you, the conversations like these, if they don't leave this room, we're not doing our job and we're not doing our best. So take it in for what it is, but really gun control is what we're all going to make of it as voters. We've got one of the most crucial elections of, God knows how long coming up next year. So you can decide where the gun control movement's going with your vote. You know, I know that sounds so cliche. I say it all the time and it feels cliche, but that's all we can do anymore, right?
I mean, just to add in a slightly different perspective on that. So for the march itself, I did a lot of the political work. I had to work on the Hill for an extended period of time, getting meetings, interviews, trying to get something done on the federal level, which everyone knows nothing has happened yet. The truth is, most politicians in office, the reason why they don't act on this issue is because it doesn't sell well. You know, it doesn't resonate with a lot of voters in the Midwest that you might want to put some provisions that might stop them from owning certain guns. I understand it doesn't sell well. Even President Obama, after the Sandy Hook tragedy, you were thinking, you know, you have a stacked House, Congress, and the President. Why did nothing happen? The reason why he spent most of his political capital on Medicaid, and then when a big issue like this comes up, if he had pursued it, it might have looked bad. It's, frankly, in my opinion, selfish. And I respect politicians a lot because I understand the importance of politics in a nation. But the future of gun control is going to go where the media goes, because if this becomes an issue where candidates who support certain positions start winning elections because it starts selling well, then we might actually get some change.
That's the thing. It's a game like that. I mean, that's why you see if any of you have watched the Democratic primary debates. In the beginning, every time there was a question about gun control policy, within 10 seconds, my friends and I used to play a game where we would count to 10, and then within the first 10 seconds, they'd talk about how inspiring the Parkland kids are. And that's because talking about how inspiring the Parkland kids are sells a lot better than, well, here's what I'm going to do. So the media is a big part of it, and that's less about journalism and more about how the politicians handle it. But, you know, you all decide. You know, everybody here probably can vote, and if not, you can talk about it. You all decide where the gun control movement's going to go.
Yeah, and also to that point, not to detract from that, I think the gun debate is a really important issue. Debate that we have to have. But we've been having it for a few decades now. I mean, how long ago was Virginia Tech and Columbine? I mean, a couple of decades. I think we just memorialized Columbine. So those are important issues, but they're huge issues to deal with. Right? It's something that's very hard to get through the Congress, and I know that incrementalism isn't particularly sexy, right? It's not sexy to say that. Oh, maybe we'll make a few reforms to make sure that this shooter didn't have quite as much access, or maybe we'll just do red flag laws. But sometimes good is good enough in that it just moves the ball forward, right? Because as much as guns are an issue, I think the uniquely American issue that we have here is the fact that there was a kid that wanted to shoot up a school and then went through with it, right? There are other countries that have firearms. You know, the deadliest school shooting in our country was done, everybody wants to say it was an AR-15, but the deadliest school shooting in the country was Virginia Tech, done with 2 handguns, right? And other countries have handguns. I think the uniquely American issue here is that, you know, there was a sickness in this kid, and not only was there a sickness, but so many of the very capable adults who were not sick failed to take care of that kid. And I don't want to empathize with him, but something that I think was one of the most horrific things, there's 2 details that I struggle with to this day. The first one is that we knew how sick this kid was, right? He was cutting his wrist, drinking gasoline, said he wanted to bathe in the blood of his classmates. He was exhibiting signs. He was talking about cannibalizing his friends. He was telling friends that he was going to kill them. And the counselors, their recommendation to him was, you know what, let's enroll you in marksmanship. Stoneman Douglas taught him how to shoot, and he eventually used it on the school after this. Right? That's incredibly disturbing to me. But even beyond that is this kid's last Google search. His very last Google search that we found through the commission was how to stop homicidal thoughts. Right? This kid knew his issue. in my opinion, from that search, didn't want to do it.
Begged and pleaded for help constantly.
I mean, this kid begged for it. I mean, and one of the worst things, I don't want to take too much time, but I think this is really important, is Andrew Pollock is one of the parents. He's one of the brashest, one of the most Republican, and incredibly controversial at times. He is not one to hold punches, right? If anybody should want to see this kid fried and hung at the stake, it's Andrew Pollock. He said to me once, and I was asking him, do you think this kid should be put to death? And he said, I think I'm going to testify in his defense. Why in the world would you testify in his defense? He said, you know what? This kid was 50% of the problem. Because the system was sicker than he was. I mean, there were 68 calls. 100 cries for help. Everyone knew. I mean, this kid went in with swastikas on his arms and neck, and they still sold him the gun. Right? This kid pled for help, and they put him in marksmanship. Kids complained that he was threatening to shoot up the school, and they said, well, he has autism, just deal with it. Right? There were so many missed opportunities. And I think in a lot of ways Andrew realizes, regardless of what he did to my kid, and I think he should be punished for that, there were so many people that assisted him in doing that. That's what's heartbreaking to me.
I want to take our last audience question from Adelina, and then we'll have closing remarks from Professor Matloff and Dr. Saltz. But Adelina, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Adelina. I'm a PhD student in the J School. Thank you all for being here. This is a question for the students that I think is maybe journalism adjacent, but something that I read maybe a year ago, whenever the Thousand Oaks shooting happened, is Roxanne Gay wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and she said what really struck her was the fact that all the survivors who were being interviewed were really composed, and it was as though they had a script and they knew what to say. So I wondered to what extent you thought that matched your experience. How true do you think that is? That because, talk about the 24-hour news cycle, we're hearing these stories over and over again. To what extent do you think, in your experience when you were giving interviews, do you think they became, I don't mean this as a value judgment, but formulaic, how much do you think you learned from stories like this in the past?
I think that the precedent is just now kind of starting to set in. When Douglas happened, I don't think there was a full precedent. The most recent mass shooting that I could think of before Douglas was Vegas, mass shooting that we were all debating in school. And actually, I was debating it alongside a young woman named Helena Ramsey, who was killed in the shooting. And we had all talked about gun control. We had all talked about it every time it was the popular conversation. But I think right now, after Parkland, one of the biggest changes that's happened is there's starting to be a little bit clearer a story and a little bit more of a machine after a mass shooting. For example, the San Antonio shooting didn't get nearly as much coverage because those kids weren't talking about gun control, and that's what the media wants to talk about, is gun control. So once these kids who were Republicans were getting killed, everybody was like, oh yeah, sorry. But yeah, they do sound formulaic. I felt like a broken record a lot of times. Alfonso and I, we actually have this thing we do where I will sometimes call him and berate him with the same questions we get asked a lot, just to annoy him. I'll say, oh my God, you kids, you inspiring kids, I'm so proud of all of you, but really, how do you do it every day? Like, how do you be so inspiring every day? So it was very repetitive, but to a certain extent, we understood that we just needed our words to be heard, and it was gonna get repetitive. But how much can you say about the most preventable mass shooting that I could possibly think of? If you're doing 1,000 interviews, a lot of them are going to be the same.
Yeah, and just to very quickly say something on that, I think the reason why interviews became, at least for me, so formulaic is because I was being asked the same questions from the journalist perspective. I think if you want to have an interview that not only stands out and gets the coverage that you want, while also is telling a compelling story, maybe ask questions that aren't being typically asked. And in almost every single interview I ever did, I was asked the same three questions of, where were you? Which personally I don't believe is very relevant to what actually happened or the experience someone could have. How are you dealing with this? And what do you think about whatever news story was just happening, breaking news, either a vote or someone said some inflammatory language? That was it. That was it. That doesn't really tell a compelling story, and those have easily formulaic answers that I could give you, because when your entire life becomes centered on tragedy and you have to constantly think about it every single day, it's a weird way of expressing it, but you become an expert on what just happened. So if someone asks you the same question over and over and over, and it's literally hundreds of times, I'm not going to be compelled to give you an interesting answer, something new, because you're asking me the same thing.
Professor Ballard.
Well, as a sum up, one resource that is really valuable for people who are going to be covering violence here is the Dart Center, which is located on the 5th floor. And if you go to the website, dartcenter.org, there are incredible tip sheets about the proper way to ask questions and the proper way to cover these types of stories from an ethical point of view. What the Dart Center also has, which we haven't unfortunately had time to touch upon today, is the impact of covering violence on the journalists themselves. When you are actually working in an environment where you are also under threat, so you're not only dealing with people who've gone through it themselves, but you yourself are actually threatened and are immersed for years and years covering violence, which is what happens to you when you're covering a war, and likewise. So it's really, it's a phenomenal resource, and I really recommend that people consult it and see what's out on there on the website and really incorporate it. The other thing I want to say is, and it's something that's really struck me teaching here for nearly 20 years, the one thing we really don't do well here at the J School is teach people how to do interviews. It's the one weak thing. We just don't teach it. And I don't think any journalism school really does properly. And I think that's one takeaway from this panel today. It's that we really have to think about how we're actually conducting these conversations with people.
That's very interesting. That really is. And you brought up a point, which is taking care of ourselves. So closing remarks now. We're a couple of minutes before, I guess, 8 o'clock. Dr. Gail Saltz, I want to end with you and kind of flip the script. I think we will do something broader on how journalists take care of themselves. But for the young reporters, myself included here in the room tonight, who are exposed to these kinds of stories and who are working really hard to get it right, what's your hope for them when they look out for themselves, they take care of themselves, they don't fall into these traps, but when it comes to their mental health, they check in so that they can have endurance to do this job for the long haul?
Well, I think that very few reporters have any idea that one can develop PTSD, basically vicarious PTSD from being privy to, and in close quarters with intense trauma, and particularly repetitively. So when reporters start to feel, increasing anxiety, fearful feelings, wishes that they could avoid certain things, feelings of I'm so burnt out, I don't know how I can keep doing this, have sleep disruption, appetite disruption, don't take care of themselves as well as they did before, that these might be symptoms of PTSD. And so it is really important to just know that that's the case, to think about how you manage the trauma in your job and in your experience. As was pointed out in the keynote, it is important to not only do things that make you happy, but exercise is actually goes head to head with medication for mild to moderate depression. I mean, exercise increases mood, decreases anxiety on a regular basis. I personally would, as a mental health professional, recommend not doing the over-drinking part because actually alcohol is a depressant, and many people in journalism do turn to alcohol or more substances, and actually that usually backfires. Those sorts of things actually make symptoms worse. They raise anxiety, they lower mood, and you can develop a substance abuse problem.
I was going to say, we know that there are behavioral health issues that can result from
So you want to think about how you are taking care of yourself, but you want to think about your coping mechanism. So some people develop alcohol as their coping mechanism. It's not a good one, but you do want to have coping mechanisms. So what do you do to relax? What do you do with the images and the thoughts that are replaying in your head, because you're seeing them all the time, you're writing about them all the time, you're looking at them all the time. So you do need to have a sort of a toolbox to manage those thoughts that you have, those ruminations, or those things that you're immersed in constantly. And if you are starting to really be affected, think about seeing a mental health professional. It is important. I would also say I'm disheartened and kind of blown away by some of the experiences that you had with journalists. I would hope that, but maybe, that's why it's so important you're doing this tonight, that journalists understand that, in fact, they can further traumatize a victim of trauma. You can actually take someone who is maybe on the path from acute stress and going to resolve and derail them into a post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, memory is only what we register and hold on to. You can change memory by asking someone to tell a story, by adding to their story, by highlighting things that weren't even in their story. And then they can reprocess that, and that can become their memory. You can really alter for the negative someone's traumatic experience. So you have a big responsibility when you are interviewing. It's not just your job, it's a responsibility for a human being that you're interacting with when you go in to tell their story and interview them. And I think you have to think first to do no harm. And you can, so you have to think about how you're going to handle that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that as journalists, you know, we empower ourselves to hold the powerful accountable, but we wield so much influence in the public conversation that forums like tonight, I think, are really meant to see if we can sort of check ourselves and apply that same standard to us and really re-examine the way that we use the influence and the power to dominate a discussion smartly or in some ways that we may not realize have caused harm. Have you three ever talked about this publicly in this depth before, the impact of journalism?
Absolutely not.
Good. Well, I'm glad that we got to do it tonight. First of all, thank you, Professor Judith Matloff, Kenneth Preston, Alfonso Calderon, Cameron Cassidy, Dr. Grasshouse. Thank you so much to all of you at the Columbia Journalism School for helping us put this on. Thank you, everybody, and good night. Thank you.